Naomi's call button glowed above her seat like a silent challenge. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick now, passengers shifting uncomfortably, pretending not to notice. But she knew they were watching. They always did. Jessica approached, her expression tight, her patience clearly running thin. "Ma'am, I already told you we'll be serving drinks shortly." Naomi's voice was calm but unyielding. "You already served everyone else." Jessica's mouth opened, a flimsy excuse ready to roll off her tongue, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the air. Deep, commanding. "I'd like a word, now." The cabin fell into a stunned silence as Richard Campbell, the airline's CEO, stood up from his seat in economy and strode toward them. Naomi didn't flinch, but she saw the color drain from Jessica's face. Jessica's jaw tightened, but the confidence she had exuded earlier was nowhere to be found. "Sir, Richard raised a hand, silencing her effortlessly. He turned to Naomi with the kind of measured respect she had been denied all night. "Ms. Brooks, I sincerely apologize for what you've experienced, and rest assured, this will be handled immediately." Jessica stiffened. "Sir, if I may—" "You may not," Richard interrupted coldly. He turned to Mark, the senior flight attendant. "You allowed this to happen under your watch. Both of you, follow me, now." A hush fell over the cabin as the two crew members were escorted away, their stiff strides betraying the panic creeping into their bones. The whispers started before they even reached the galley. Naomi exhaled, her fingers releasing their grip on the armrest. She hadn't wanted a scene, but she would not be invisible. And tonight, the right people had been watching. But before we dive deeper into this story, tell me, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like these, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on the next one. The glass walls of LAX gleamed under the artificial glow of midnight lights, reflecting the endless movement of travelers dragging their carry-ons across the polished floors. The airport was alive, but not in the rushed chaos of the daytime. This was a different energy. It was quieter, filled with the heavy sighs of exhausted passengers, the occasional murmur of conversations, and the robotic drone of boarding announcements crackling through the overhead speakers. Naomi Brooks walked through the terminal with effortless confidence, her navy blazer tailored to perfection, her slacks pressed with crisp lines. She wasn't rushing. She didn't need to. Years in corporate law had trained her to command space without demanding it, to walk into a room and make people feel her presence before she even spoke. She kept her gaze forward, her leather carry-on slung over one shoulder, the sharp clicks of her heels swallowed by the cavernous space around her. She had taken this route countless times before. Business-class lounges, priority boarding lines, exclusive airport lounges with complimentary champagne and pristine leather seats. She had earned this. Yet, even now, even here, she felt the unspoken weight of being watched. The first one came at security. She had placed her laptop, phone, and shoes neatly in the gray plastic bin, just like everyone else. Yet the TSA agent had let his gaze linger a little longer than necessary. The white man in front of her, a tech executive judging by his Patagonia vest and AirPods, had breezed through without so much as a second glance. But Naomi, she got the double check. The barely concealed once-overs, she could feel it. It wasn't new and it wasn't surprising. The pause, the flicker of something in their eyes, the momentary hesitation that screamed, "Do you belong here?" It was subtle, but she had spent a lifetime noticing the things others pretended weren't happening. She let it roll off her like water. She wasn't in the mood to fight silent battles tonight. Not here, not now. She had an 8-hour flight ahead of her, a full schedule waiting for her in London, and a legal team counting on her to be sharp when she landed. She had more important things to focus on than the quiet racism woven into the fabric of everyday life. But the feeling clung to her skin like static, a low hum of awareness that never truly left. As she approached the gate, she saw the first-class boarding line was already forming. A white businessman stood in front of her, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, the kind of man who probably owned 3 vacation homes and referred to women in the office as sweetheart. She watched as he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, a young blonde woman with an over-rehearsed smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Calloway," she chirped, scanning his pass. "Would you like a glass of champagne before takeoff?" He chuckled, made some offhand comment about how he never says no to champagne, and waltzed down the jet bridge like he was stepping onto his private jet. Then came Naomi's turn. She handed over her boarding pass, standing with the same quiet poise she always carried, expecting the usual brief exchange. The gate agent's smile faltered the moment she glanced at the name on the ticket. Her brows twitched almost imperceptibly, but Naomi caught it. There it was. The pause. A flicker of something. Confusion? Doubt? The woman glanced down at the ticket again, as if double-checking whether a black woman could possibly be seated in 2A, the front row of first class. Naomi didn't react. She simply waited, her expression unreadable, as the gate agent forced a polite nod and handed the ticket back. "Enjoy your flight," she said, but the warmth in her voice was noticeably absent. No offer of champagne, no cheerful welcome, just a stiff businesslike dismissal. Naomi took the boarding pass without a word and stepped onto the jet bridge, her face unreadable. Inside, she felt it, the sharp shift in the air, the unspoken difference in how she was treated versus the man before her. But she didn't flinch, didn't react. She had been here before. She knew this game. The moment she stepped onto the plane, the crisp artificial chill of the cabin wrapped around her. The first-class section was a world of its own. Wide leather seats, dim ambient lighting, the soft murmur of already settled passengers sipping their complimentary drinks. A flight attendant stood by the entrance, her uniform perfectly pressed, her dark blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. Jessica Morgan, according to the polished name tag pinned neatly to her blazer. The second Naomi stepped forward, Jessica's eyes flicked downward, first to Naomi's carry-on, then back to her face. A split-second assessment. Another pause. Naomi saw it all happen in real time, the subtle shift in posture, the way Jessica's lips pressed together just a little tighter than before. Naomi had spent years in boardrooms reading people's micro-expressions. She didn't need words to know what Jessica was thinking. Jessica didn't smile, didn't say welcome aboard. Instead, she simply stepped aside, her expression neutral, almost detached, and let Naomi pass. Naomi held her head high, moving with practiced grace as she walked down the aisle toward her seat. The businessman from earlier was already settled into 2B across the aisle from her. A flight attendant, a different one, younger, with a bright smile, was already pouring him a glass of champagne. Naomi slid into 2A, the front row window seat, and placed her carry-on neatly in the overhead bin. She adjusted her blazer, took a calming breath, and glanced around. The businessman was already sipping his drink, flipping through his in-flight menu, utterly oblivious to the quiet storm brewing 3 feet away from him. No one offered Naomi a drink. The realization settled in like a lead weight in her stomach. Every other first-class passenger had a glass of champagne or sparkling water in hand. Every single one. Except her. She let her gaze drift toward the galley where Jessica was standing talking quietly with another flight attendant. Not once did she glance Naomi's way, not once did she acknowledge her presence. It wasn't an oversight, it was a choice. Naomi exhaled slowly, staring at the untouched tray table in front of her, a quiet fire igniting in her chest. She wasn't looking for special treatment. She wasn't asking for anything more than what everyone else had been given freely. But what she refused to accept, what she would never accept, was being treated as invisible. She pressed the call button. The soft chime of the call button cut through the hushed murmur of the first-class cabin, drawing a few glances from nearby passengers. Naomi kept her expression unreadable, her posture relaxed but deliberate. She wasn't being impatient, she was being observant. From the moment she'd taken her seat, she had watched the seamless choreography of first-class service unfold. Flight attendants moved with polished efficiency, pouring golden champagne into delicate glass flutes, their voices warm as they exchanged pleasantries with the passengers. A man 2 rows ahead chuckled at something a flight attendant said, his glass already half empty, while another passenger swirled her drink absent-mindedly as she scrolled through her phone. The entire cabin radiated quiet luxury. Yet Naomi's tray table remained empty. her call button glowing softly like a warning light no one wanted to acknowledge. Jessica appeared moments later, her expression carefully neutral, but Naomi caught the flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am?" Her voice was clipped, efficient, devoid of the practiced hospitality Naomi had seen her offer everyone else. Naomi met her gaze with calm precision. "Can I have a glass of water, please?" Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line, as if Naomi had asked for something unreasonable. "We'll be serving drinks shortly," she said, tone flat, offering nothing further before pivoting on her heel and disappearing down the aisle. Naomi exhaled slowly, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest as she watched Jessica move effortlessly from one row to the next. There was no delay in service when it came to the other passengers. As if to confirm Naomi's suspicions, Jessica stopped 2 seats ahead, where a middle-aged man had just leaned over to ask something. Naomi didn't hear what he said, but she didn't need to. Jessica gave a polite nod, reached for the bottle of champagne, and poured him a fresh glass without hesitation. The golden liquid bubbled up to the rim, catching the ambient glow of the cabin's warm lighting. She smiled at the man, said something pleasant, and moved on, without a second glance in Naomi's direction. Naomi felt something simmer beneath her composure, something sharp and undeniable. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. She wasn't being served because Jessica had chosen not to serve her. The thought settled like a stone in her stomach, heavy but familiar. It wasn't new, this quiet exclusion. It was the kind of thing she had encountered her entire life, the small but deliberate reminders that some people didn't see her as deserving of the space she occupied. Her fingers grazed the edge of the call button again, but she hesitated. Not because she was afraid of causing a scene, no. Naomi had long since outgrown that worry, but because she was calculating. There was always a way to handle these moments, a way to force accountability without giving people an excuse to twist the narrative. She wasn't going to give Jessica the satisfaction of dismissing her as an overreacting passenger. Instead, she was going to make sure this moment wouldn't be ignored. She sat back, exhaling slowly, and waited. Naomi took a slow breath, steadying herself against the quiet heat simmering in her chest. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe Jessica was just busy, overwhelmed, preoccupied. But no, she had seen it too many times before to mistake it for anything else. The deliberate slowness, the absence of warmth, the way her presence was treated as an afterthought. It was the kind of thing that couldn't be proven in a single moment, but became undeniable in patterns. And this was a pattern. She let her gaze drift across the cabin, not searching for validation, but curious if anyone else had noticed. The woman across the aisle, mid-40s, blonde, dressed in a cream cashmere sweater, was shifting uncomfortably. Naomi hadn't paid her much attention before, but now she saw the way the woman's eyes flickered between Naomi's empty tray table and the champagne glasses scattered across the cabin. She knew. Naomi could see it in the tight press of her lips, the way her fingers toyed with the stem of her own glass. But she wouldn't say anything. That was always how it was. People noticed, but silence was easier than confrontation. The woman turned her gaze down to the in-flight magazine, feigning interest in an article she clearly wasn't reading. Naomi straightened her posture, adjusting her blazer as she let the moment settle. Fine. If Jessica was going to pretend she didn't exist, then Naomi would wait. She wasn't going to beg for decency. The food service began shortly after takeoff, a quiet rustling of activity as flight attendants moved through the cabin with the polished efficiency that first-class passengers expected. Naomi watched as they placed neatly arranged trays of filet mignon, grilled salmon, and seasonal salads in front of the other travelers, offering warm smiles as they confirmed choices. When Jessica reached Naomi's row, her demeanor remained detached, professional, but void of the friendliness she had extended to the others. "Would you like the grilled salmon or the filet mignon?" Her voice was flat, the words mechanical. Naomi met her eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of recognition that she was aware of what she was doing. Nothing, just polite indifference. "Salmon, please." Jessica barely nodded, jotted it down quickly, and moved on without acknowledgement. Naomi watched as she stepped over to the man seated across the aisle, an older gentleman in a navy suit, silver hair neatly combed back. The contrast was immediate. Jessica's posture softened slightly, her tone lifted just enough to sound pleasant. "And for you, sir?" The man barely glanced up from his tablet. "I'll have the grilled salmon," Jessica smiled, nodding approvingly as she scribbled it down. "Excellent choice." Naomi's fingers curled into her lap, nails pressing into her palm. It wasn't the words that got to her, it was the difference, the acknowledgement, the small but deliberate way Jessica had decided that his presence deserved warmth, while Naomi's deserved nothing. The intent behind it was clear, sharp enough to cut. It wasn't unconscious bias, it was a choice. It had always bothered her that everyone seemed to see the world as it was for them, when there was a perfectly good one for them. Naomi didn't hesitate this time. Her finger pressed the call button with quiet precision, the soft chime cutting through the otherwise undisturbed hum of the cabin. She didn't look around to see who noticed. She already knew. People always noticed these moments, even when they pretended they didn't. Jessica appeared seconds later, her expression carefully neutral but her posture stiff. "Yes, ma'am?" The words were polite, but the clipped tone made them feel like an obligation rather than a genuine offer to help. Naomi met her gaze with unwavering calm. "Why am I being treated differently?" Jessica blinked, her lips parting slightly as if caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Excuse me?" Naomi didn't flinch. "I've watched you serve every other passenger in this cabin with warmth and attention. I've seen the smiles, the small talk, the care, but when it comes to me, you barely acknowledge my presence. I ask for a drink. I'm told to wait while you serve others immediately. I order my meal and I get a dismissive nod while the man next to me gets an excellent choice. So, I'll ask again, why am I being treated differently?" Jessica's back straightened. "I assure you, ma'am, I'm treating everyone the same." A hollow, practiced response. Naomi let the words hang in the air for a moment, giving Jessica space to feel the weight of them. She could see the flicker of discomfort in the woman's eyes, the way her hands clasped a little tighter in front of her. Before Jessica could speak again, another presence loomed. Head Flight Attendant Mark Evans had arrived, his broad frame and neatly pressed uniform radiating the kind of authority that was meant to shut things down before they escalated. He glanced between them, assessing the situation with a look that already held judgment. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was calm but edged with that unmistakable tone of subtle warning. "No problem at all," Naomi said evenly. "I was just asking why I'm being treated differently from the rest of the first-class passengers." Mark's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression remained composed. "Ma'am, our crew is trained to provide the same level of service to all passengers." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Then why is that not happening?" Mark exhaled through his nose, his patience thinning. "If you're unhappy with the service, you're welcome to file a complaint after landing. A non-ambit, a dismissal." Naomi recognized the tactic immediately. Deflect, redirect, minimize. It was a script she had seen play out too many times before. Passengers around them shifted subtly, their body language betraying that they were listening, even if they refused to make eye contact. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, thick with the unspoken tension that came when people were forced to bear witness to something uncomfortable. Naomi held Mark's gaze for a long, measured beat before finally leaning back in her seat. "I think I will," she said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet finality that made it clear this wasn't over. Richard Campbell sat quietly in his aisle seat in economy, his posture relaxed but his mind working with sharp precision. The hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop as he observed the first-class cabin just a few rows ahead, watching the tension unfold like a slow-moving storm. He had seen enough. The dismissive body language, the clipped responses, the way Jessica's entire demeanor shifted depending on the passenger in front of her. He had watched Mark step in, not to de-escalate a problem but to silence a passenger who had every right to demand better. And he had watched Naomi Brooks, composed, controlled, unwavering in the face of their condescension. Richard had built his airline on a reputation of excellence, but he knew better than to trust polished corporate reports and staged customer service demonstrations. That's why he traveled incognito. No press, no advance notice, no executive entourage trailing behind him. He liked to see his company the way an ordinary traveler did, through unfiltered reality. And tonight that reality was exposing an ugly crack in the foundation of his airline. His mind worked methodically, filing away every detail. Jessica's tone, stripped of warmth whenever she spoke to Naomi. The way Mark had spoken over Naomi rather than addressing her concerns. The quiet tension that spread through the first-class cabin as passengers pretended not to notice what was happening. He had seen incidents like this before, not just in his company but in the world at large, and he knew exactly how these situations played out. The woman would either let it go, file a complaint that would disappear into a bureaucratic void, or she would push back and be labeled as difficult. But Naomi wasn't difficult, she was right, and Richard wasn't about to let this slide. He pulled out his phone, but before he could type a message, it vibrated with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen. Ah, David Brooks. Richard's brow lifted slightly. David, one of his senior executives, rarely called him directly during travel unless it was urgent. He swiped to answer. David. There was no small talk. Richard, we have a situation. On flight 227. Richard's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. I know. I'm on it. Naomi exhaled slowly as she leaned back in her seat, her phone resting on her lap, the screen still glowing from the message she had just sent. She didn't like involving David like this, but this wasn't about asking for a favor. It was about making sure the right people knew what was happening. She didn't need someone to fix it for her. She needed accountability. The moment Jessica had walked away, Naomi had typed out a concise but direct text. You need to know what's happening on this flight. The crew is treating me differently. Dismissive, condescending. First-class service for everyone but me. Not an accident. Not a misunderstanding. David had responded almost instantly. Are you okay? She had kept her reply simple. I'm fine. I just don't want this ignored. David didn't hesitate. I'll take care of it. She knew what that meant. David wasn't the kind of man to storm in demanding justice, but he understood the weight of moments like this. He had spent his career ensuring that his success didn't blind him to reality, that power didn't make him complacent. He also knew his wife. He knew she wasn't someone who cried wolf. If she said something was happening, it was happening. She glanced toward the galley where Jessica and Mark were speaking in hushed tones, their body language tense. They thought this was over. They thought their authority had ended the conversation. Naomi knew better. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a short but telling message. Richard's on that flight. I just called him. He's watching. Naomi's pulse remained steady, but a slow, knowing smile touched her lips. Good. Richard's jaw tightened as he slipped his phone back into his pocket, his expression hardening. He had already seen enough, but now it was confirmed. Naomi's experience wasn't just a feeling, wasn't just her perception. It was real, and it was unacceptable. His grip on the armrest tightened slightly as he made a decision. He didn't need to wait until landing to address this. The reckoning would happen now. Raising his hand, he pressed the call button above his seat. A flight attendant appeared almost immediately, a young woman with sharp eyes and a nervous energy that suggested she had sensed something shifting in the atmosphere. Sir, how can I assist you? She asked, her voice polite but cautious. Richard didn't waste time. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority beneath it. I'd like to speak with the senior flight crew immediately. The attendant hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. Of course, sir. I'll inform them right away. She turned briskly and disappeared toward the front of the plane. Richard sat back, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest as he watched Jessica and Mark from a distance. They were still near the galley, speaking in hushed voices. He could see the way Jessica's arms were crossed tightly over her chest, the tension in her jaw, the stiffness in Mark's posture. They thought they had handled the situation. They thought the weight of their uniforms and their authority had silenced the woman in 2A. They had no idea who had been watching. Within minutes, Mark emerged from the galley, his expression shifting into a mask of professional politeness as he made his way toward economy. Jessica followed, though her usual air of quiet smugness was absent now. She looked slightly confused, unsure why they were being summoned mid-flight. When they reached Richard's row, Mark gave a carefully measured smile. "Sir, I understand you asked to speak with us." Richard didn't move, didn't acknowledge the fake pleasantries. His voice remained smooth, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "Yes, let's talk now." Jessica and Mark exchanged a quick glance. They still hadn't figured it out, but they would. And they wouldn't like what was coming next. Jessica walked into the galley first, her stride sharp with manufactured confidence. Her arms crossed in a way that made her look self-assured but defensive. Mark followed closely behind, his face carefully neutral, but carrying the quiet arrogance of a man who believed he was in control. They had been through situations like this before. Passengers who felt slighted, who mistook standard procedures for personal offenses, who thought they were owed more than what was actually expected of the crew. Mark had no doubt this was another one of those cases. Jessica certainly thought so. "Honestly, this is getting ridiculous," she muttered under her breath as she stepped inside. "Some people just like to cause problems." Mark sighed, nodding as he adjusted the cuffs of his uniform. "Let's just handle this quickly and move on. We've done nothing wrong." But then they looked up. Richard Campbell stood before them, his posture casual but commanding, his hands resting in his pockets like he had all the time in the world to deal with their incompetence. His expression was unreadable, but the sharpness in his eyes made it clear he was not here for excuses. Jessica's breath hitched slightly, her confidence flickering just enough for Mark to notice. He frowned, taking another step forward, still unsure what was happening. "Sir," Mark started, his voice still maintaining the usual smooth, corporate-trained politeness. Is there something we can help you with?" Richard tilted his head slightly, his gaze moving between them, assessing them like they were a problem that needed to be solved. Then, in a voice that was calm but slicing, he spoke. "I've been watching from the moment passengers boarded this plane." Jessica stiffened. Mark's polite smile twitched. Richard took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that the words hit harder. "And I am disgusted by what I've seen." Silence. Jessica swallowed hard, her earlier smugness vanishing so quickly it might as well have never existed. Mark shifted his weight, his fingers twitching slightly against the seam of his slacks. Richard let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing, his tone never rising, never breaking composure, but cutting through them like a blade. "You assumed she was just another demanding passenger. You assumed no one else was paying attention. That was your first mistake." His eyes flicked to Jessica, pinning her in place. "Your second was believing your attitude wouldn't have consequences." Jessica's lips parted slightly as if scrambling for a response, but nothing came out. Richard exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "The way you treated her was not an accident. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. A deliberate, condescending, ugly choice." Mark finally found his voice, his training kicking in as he attempted to regain control of the conversation. "Sir, I can assure you, we provide the same level of service to all passengers." "Don't," Richard cut in smoothly, his voice never rising but carrying enough weight to shut Mark down instantly. "I don't need to hear the company script. I wrote the company script." Jessica's breathing had turned shallow, her shoulders drawn back like a soldier awaiting orders. She was no longer looking at Richard. She was staring at a fixed point on the wall behind him, her mind racing. Richard leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as if he were physically restraining himself from saying what he really wanted to. Instead, his tone remained even. "You work for my airline. You represent my company, and tonight you have embarrassed both." Mark's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Jessica's fingers clenched at her sides. Richard gave them both a long, measured look, then nodded once, as if coming to a decision. "Done here." The finality in his tone made Jessica's stomach drop. Mark's jaw tensed. Neither of them spoke, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down on them like a vice. Jessica opened her mouth once more, maybe to apologize, maybe to justify, maybe to beg, but Richard had already turned away. For them, the flight was over. Jessica felt the walls closing in. Her throat went dry, her mind scrambling for something, anything, that would make this situation less disastrous. The confident composure she had walked in with had crumbled, leaving behind only panic, barely masked under a thin layer of professional restraint. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Richard's gaze. But the intensity behind his eyes made her stomach twist. "I was just following protocol," she stammered, her voice weaker than she intended. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful." Richard's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in the way he tilted his head slightly that made it clear he wasn't buying a single word of it. Jessica felt a flicker of desperation crawl up her spine. Mark, sensing the shift in the air, stepped in, his voice taking on the careful, controlled tone of someone trained to smooth over problems before they escalated. "Sir, if she felt that way, then we're sorry. It was never our intention to make her uncomfortable." A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Richard inhaled slowly, then let out a breath as he gave them both a look that was somehow both patient and devastatingly unimpressed. "Intentions," he said, his voice still calm but razor-sharp, "mean nothing when the impact is harm." Jessica's breath hitched. Mark's jaw tightened. Richard continued, each word landing with the weight of a gavel striking a bench. "You don't get to decide whether your behavior was acceptable. You don't get to hide behind policy when your own judgment failed. And you certainly don't get to place the burden of your actions on the person you disrespected." Jessica opened her mouth, ready to protest, ready to say something about how she had been under pressure, how she had been busy, how she had just been doing her job. But Richard's next words shut her down before she could even begin. "If this were an isolated incident, I might believe it was a lapse in judgment," he said, his gaze locked onto hers. "But it wasn't. I watched you. From the moment Naomi Brooks stepped onto this plane, you made a choice. You treated her differently. You dismissed her. You made her feel invisible while ensuring every other passenger received the service they paid for. And now, when confronted, you're looking for an excuse instead of taking responsibility." Jessica felt like the floor beneath her was vanishing. She wanted to look at Mark, to silently beg him to step in, to say something, anything, that could lessen the weight pressing down on her, but he was frozen beside her, his expression unreadable. Richard shifted his attention to Mark. "And you. You had the opportunity to course correct. Instead, you chose to defend her behavior. You made it clear that complaints like this don't matter to you. That when a passenger brings a concern to your attention, your instinct isn't to listen, it's to silence them." Mark's throat bobbed as he swallowed, but he didn't speak. He knew there was nothing he could say that wouldn't make this worse. Richard exhaled slowly, shaking his head as if he was genuinely disappointed. Then, after a pause that made every second feel like an eternity, he spoke again. "This is not how my airline operates, and this is not how my employees represent this company." Jessica's hands were clenched so tightly at her sides that her nails were pressing into her palms. She already knew what was coming next. Richard let the weight of his words settle, watching as Jessica's face drained of color. The composure she had tried so hard to maintain cracked, her carefully measured expression giving way to something raw and panicked. Her lips parted slightly, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts, as if she was still struggling to process what she had just heard. "You're fired," Richard said, his voice unwavering, final, effective immediately. Jessica let out a sharp inhale, her eyes widening. "Wait, what?" Mark stiffened beside her, his hands clenching into tight fists at his sides. His jaw twitched, but he didn't speak. Not yet. He knew. He had seen enough high-level firings to recognize when there was no room for negotiation. But Jessica, either too desperate or too arrogant to accept reality, took a small, frantic step forward. "Mr. Campbell, please." Her voice was higher now, the controls slipping. "This is completely unnecessary. I was just doing my job." Richard remained still, his expression unreadable, his patience razor-thin. "Your job," he repeated, each syllable slow and deliberate. is to provide service to all passengers, not just the ones you personally deem worthy of it. Jessica's hands trembled as she reached for words, grasping at anything that might save her. I didn't mean... Stop, Richard cut in, his voice suddenly sharp. I don't want excuses. I don't want half-hearted apologies. I gave you the opportunity to take responsibility, and you chose to deflect. Now, you live with the consequences. Jessica's eyes darted to Mark, silently pleading for backup, but he remained stone-faced. He wasn't about to go down fighting a battle he had already lost. He exhaled slowly through his nose, his fingers flexing before he finally spoke, his voice quiet, resigned. I understand. Jessica whipped her head toward him, disbelief flashing across her face. What? Mark turned his gaze toward Richard, nodding once, stiffly. I understand, he repeated, his voice tight. I won't argue with your decision. Jessica let out a strangled sound, her panic bubbling over into something dangerously close to hysteria. Are you serious? You're just going to stand there and let this happen? Mark didn't look at her. Jessica's breathing turned shallow, frantic, her body tense with fight or flight energy. She turned back to Richard, her voice shifting from desperation to forced professionalism. Mr. Campbell, please. I've worked for this airline for years. I have never once had a complaint filed against me. Yes, Richard said, tilting his head slightly. Isn't something to be proud of. It means either you've never been caught before, or that passengers like Naomi knew better than to waste their breath complaining about someone like you. Jessica blinked rapidly, her chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. This is my career, she whispered. I need this job. Richard's expression didn't soften. And Naomi needed to be treated with the same respect you so effortlessly gave everyone else in that cabin. But you chose to deny her that. You made your decision, Jessica, and now I'm making mine. Jessica's breath hitched, her hands shaking as she took a half-step back. She looked like she wanted to fight, like she wanted to scream, like she wanted to tear apart the walls of the galley itself in frustration. But there was nothing she could say. The verdict had already been delivered. Mark, still stiff, gave Richard a final nod. What do you need us to do? Richard held his gaze for a moment before answering. When we land, you will hand over your IDs and uniforms to security. HR will contact you with your termination paperwork. You are not to interact with any passengers for the remainder of the flight. You will take a seat in the jump seat by the rear galley and wait until we reach Heathrow. Jessica swallowed, hard, looking for any sign of mercy in Richard's expression. She found none. Understood? Richard asked. Mark nodded once. Jessica hesitated for a fraction of a second before finally, reluctantly whispering, yes. Richard took one last look at them before stepping past them, heading back toward the cabin. The decision had been made, the sentence had been passed. There was nothing left to say. The first-class cabin was quieter now, though the tension still lingered in the air, like the final notes of a song no one wanted to acknowledge. Conversations had resumed in hushed tones, passengers stealing cautious glances at Naomi when they thought she wasn't looking. Some, like the woman across the aisle, shifted uncomfortably, knowing full well they had witnessed something wrong, but choosing silence instead of confrontation. Others exchanged murmurs, their voices barely above a whisper, as if afraid speaking too loudly might implicate them in something they had tried to ignore. Naomi sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, her expression calm. But inside, she was still processing. She had won. Not in the dramatic, triumphant way people imagined victories should feel, but in the quiet, weighty way that came from forcing people to see what they tried to pretend wasn't happening. She didn't need Jessica or Mark's apologies. She didn't care about their regret, real or forced. That wasn't the point. The point was that if she had stayed silent, nothing would have changed. She thought back to every time she had let moments like this slide, to every time she had swallowed the frustration, the humiliation, the injustice, because it was easier than being labeled difficult or angry. She had spent years perfecting the art of selective confrontation, choosing her battles carefully, knowing that even when she was right, the world would find a way to paint her as wrong. But tonight she had spoken up, and tonight the right people had listened. She exhaled slowly, finally allowing herself to settle into her seat. The plane was still hours away from landing, but for the first time since takeoff, she felt a real sense of peace. A movement to her left caught her eye. Richard Campbell had stepped into the first-class cabin, making his way toward her row with the same unshakable confidence he had displayed in the galley. Passengers stiffened slightly at the sight of him, recognizing now who he was. He ignored them. Stopping beside Naomi's seat, he inclined his head slightly. "Ms. Brooks, may I sit?" Naomi studied him for a moment before nodding. "Of course." Richard lowered himself into the seat across from her, resting his elbows lightly on his knees, his expression unreadable, but his presence deliberate. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The plane hummed around them, the quiet press of altitude settling in their ears. Then Richard exhaled, his voice lower than it had been before, not because he was being careful, but because he was being intentional. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "I owe you action." Naomi held his stare, letting the words sink in, measuring their weight. She had dealt with executives before. She had heard apologies that were nothing more than damage control, words strung together to placate without meaning anything. But this was different. "Then make sure this never happens again," she said simply. Richard nodded, his expression serious. "That's exactly what I intend to do." She believed him, not because she wanted to, but because she could see it. He wasn't just embarrassed by what had happened. He was angry. Not just at Jessica or Mark, but at the system that had allowed them to believe their actions were acceptable in the first place. Richard glanced around the cabin, his gaze briefly landing on the passengers who were still pretending not to listen, before returning to Naomi. "You handled yourself with more composure than most people would have," he admitted. "Including me." Naomi's lips twitched slightly, though the smile never fully formed. "It's not my first time." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That was the problem, wasn't it? It should have been the first time, it should have been the last. I won't let this be something we just move past," he said, his voice firm. "There will be real changes." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Like what?" Richard straightened, his voice taking on the same commanding edge it had in the galley. "Effective immediately, there will be mandatory inclusivity training for all staff. Not just flight attendants, but ground crews, corporate employees, everyone. If you wear this company's name, you will understand what it means to treat every passenger with the same level of respect." Naomi nodded once, waiting. "I'll also be implementing an anonymous reporting system for passengers," he continued. "Too often, complaints like this disappear because they aren't taken seriously. That ends now. If a crew member behaves inappropriately, passengers will have a direct line to report it without fear of being dismissed." Naomi raised an eyebrow, impressed. "And?" Richard's lips pressed together for a moment before he finished, his voice laced with finality. "Zero tolerance. Anyone who engages in this kind of behavior again won't just be reprimanded, they'll be fired. Immediately." Naomi studied him, searching for any hint of hesitation. She found none. For the first time that night, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "Good." Naomi stepped onto the jet bridge, the crisp London air filtering through the terminal as the city slowly came to life beyond the glass windows. The early morning skyline stretched across the horizon, golden light peeking through low-hanging clouds, a quiet reminder that the world kept moving forward. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floors, each step carrying the weight of everything that had happened on that flight. Yet, she felt lighter than she had in hours. There was no tension in her shoulders, no simmering frustration left to suppress. It was done. Not just the flight, but the moment. The confrontation, the reckoning, the justice that had been demanded and delivered in real time. Her phone buzzed in her hand, the screen lighting up with a message from David. "Richard called, said you handled it brilliantly. Proud of you." She let out a slow breath, a quiet exhale of relief, of satisfaction, of something deeper than just personal vindication. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. She typed back a short reply. Landed safe, we'll call soon." Slipping her phone into her bag, she glanced around at the other passengers disembarking. Some avoided her gaze, pretending to be focused on their own schedules, their own baggage, their own lives. Others, like the woman from across the aisle, met her eyes briefly, offering a hesitant but knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement, a recognition of what had been seen, of what had been ignored, and of what had been forced into the light. Naomi nodded back once before turning forward again. Justice wasn't just served, it was cemented. Across the airport, inside a stark white HR office tucked away from the bustling terminal, Jessica sat stiffly in a chair, her hands shaking as she gripped the pen hovering over the termination documents in front of her. The air in the room was thick, oppressive, the reality of what had just happened sinking into her skin like a slow, suffocating weight. Her name was printed neatly at the top of the paperwork, next to the word Démonation, unforgiving letters. Her fingers trembled as she finally pressed the pen to paper, signing away the career she had built. The career she had thought was unshakable. Beside her, Mark sat motionless, his expression carved from stone, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. He hadn't spoken much since they were escorted off the plane, but the fury rolling off him was palpable. Not fury at himself, at his choices, at his complicity. No, that would have required self-awareness. His anger was at the outcome, at the fact that someone had actually held him accountable. When Jessica finally set the pen down, the HR representative took the documents without a word, gathering them into a neat stack before standing. "You'll be escorted out," she said simply. "You are no longer employed by this airline." Jessica's breath hitched, her fingers gripping the edge of the table like she needed something to ground her. Mark didn't move, his knuckles white as he balled his fists. Minutes later, they stepped out into the terminal, surrounded by travelers rushing to their gates, flight attendants moving seamlessly through the crowds, pilots exchanging brief words before heading to their next flights. The world kept moving, as if nothing had happened, as if they had never been part of it. They weren't anymore. Meanwhile, Naomi stood near the baggage claim, watching as the carousel hummed to life, luggage beginning to roll onto the conveyor belt. The weight of the past few hours settled into something else now, not exhaustion, not even triumph, but clarity. She had never wanted revenge. She hadn't even wanted an apology. She had wanted to be seen. She had wanted them to understand that ignoring her, dismissing her, making her feel invisible had consequences, that silence was no longer an option, that people like Jessica and Mark could no longer operate in the shadows, treating passengers however they pleased without repercussions. This moment would not change everything. It wouldn't erase the thousands of times someone else had been overlooked, dismissed, treated as lesser just because they existed in a space that others didn't think they belonged in. But it was a start. And sometimes that was enough. Have you ever witnessed or experienced subtle discrimination? How did you respond? Do you think companies do enough to hold their employees accountable for bias? Tyson doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. But when you refuse to be silent, you force the world to see you, and that is how change begins. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of something you've seen or experienced, don't let it end here. Conversations like these matter, and the more we talk about them, the harder they become to ignore. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that shine a light on the truth. Stories of courage, resilience, and change. Because change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we stand up, when we speak out, when we refuse to let injustice go unnoticed. Together we can create a world where dignity isn't a privilege, it's a given. Where respect isn't selective, it's universal. Where no one has to fight to be seen. Because the moment we stop accepting quiet discrimination is the moment we start demanding real equality. The moment we stop letting things slide is the moment we start shaping a future where these stories don't have to be told anymore. And that is a future worth fighting for.